The man known to history as King Edward VIII of the United Kingdom and Emperor of India came into the world on the 23rd of June 1894 at White Lodge, Richmond Park in Surrey, England. His father was George, the firstborn son of Edward, Prince of Wales, who was himself the son and heir of Britain's Queen Victoria. Given that Victoria was already in her mid-70s when young Edward was born in 1894, it was apparent that her son, the future Edward VII, Prince of Wales and Edward's grandfather, would soon take her place. Together, George and Mary had 6 children, 5 sons and 1 daughter. Edward was the eldest, but nearly as significant as time passed was the next eldest child, a son named Albert, after his great-grandfather, Victoria's long-deceased husband, whose death she had never truly overcome. Edward's full given name was Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, and throughout his youth, he was invariably referred to within the family circle as David. Edward was groomed from his earliest years to be a future king. While he would undoubtedly not ascend the throne for several decades, accidental deaths and illnesses had created circumstances where someone in Edward's position in the line of succession could sometimes inherit the crown at a very young age. His parents were distant and somewhat abrupt in their parenting style, yet it wasn't an entirely unhappy home, although Edward developed a wariness towards his father's angry reactions to relatively minor matters. He later remarked in his memoirs that he felt unloved, and his childhood experiences appear to have instilled in him a reluctance to have children later in life, which he never did. More generally, Edward gained a reputation for having an easy charm in his younger years, enabling him to mingle freely with people from different social classes, though his intellectual capacity was hardly exceptional. During these formative years, he and his siblings received their education primarily at home at York Cottage in Sandringham and at Frogmore near Windsor Castle. As he reached his teenage years, Prince Edward was dispatched to the Naval College at Osborne on the Isle of Wight. From there, he advanced to the Royal Naval College and subsequently served aboard HMS Britannia. This mirrored almost exactly the training his father had undergone in his youth, and has indeed remained a standard path for royal princes ever since. Despite being an heir to the throne, Edward was not excessively shielded and encountered some bullying during his naval youth. Otherwise, his upbringing was somewhat restricted. He was not trained to cultivate his intellect or become a notable scholar in the manner his predecessors in the 17th or 18th centuries might have been. Consequently, he matured with an intellectually constrained perspective on the world. This limited intellectual growth became particularly concerning when, in May 1910, following the death of his grandfather, his father became king, making Edward the heir to the throne at the age of 15. In keeping with tradition, he was soon granted the title of Prince of Wales, and though still a teenager, was rapidly introduced into public life. Occasional appearances at public functions were interspersed throughout the early 1910s, with studies at the University of Oxford, which his father had decided Edward should attend. However, Edward demonstrated himself to be an unenthusiastic student, and when upheaval struck Europe towards the end of his time there, he welcomed the diversion. In the summer of 1914, war spread across Europe. It had been simmering for decades, as the rise of a unified Germany in the 1870s had upset the balance of power in Central Europe and established a major competitor to Britain. Other factors, such as competition for colonial territories in Africa and intense nationalist feelings in the Balkans, where the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire vied for control over the declining Ottoman Empire, had further complicated the situation. Ultimately, it was a regional crisis there in the summer of 1914, the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, by a Serb nationalist, that ignited the conflict. In the final days of July and the first week of August, Britain, France, and Russia entered the war against Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The primary front for the British throughout what soon became known as the First World War was in northern France, where British and French forces quickly became entrenched in a war of attrition against the Germans. As part of the royal family's effort to demonstrate solidarity with the millions of British men being conscripted and sent to fight in France, Prince Edward and others were tasked with serving as officers in the army. Edward received his commission into the Grenadier Guards in the last days of July 1914 and adapted very well to military service, discovering a sense of camaraderie that his studies had failed to provide. However, his wartime experience could hardly be described as genuine. Neither Edward nor any other senior royals or members of major noble families could be put in harm's way, where capture or death was a risk. As such, for much of the subsequent 4 years, he was effectively supervised by his fellow soldiers in various roles across northern France. Some duties were symbolic, like being sent as a royal emissary to meet French generals, but his appearances inspecting British army camps on the Western Front are believed to have genuinely boosted morale. Indeed, despite extensive precautions, Edward did face danger during the war on 1 or 2 occasions, notably when his driver was killed by artillery fire and his car crashed in northern France. Furthermore, his activities weren't confined to France. He visited the Middle East in 1916 to meet Britain's Australian and New Zealander allies. The war held significance in another respect that would have minor implications for Edward and his family for decades. At the conflict's beginning, the royal family was known as the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. This name had been instituted in 1901 following King Edward VII's succession, ending the nearly 2-century rule of the House of Hanover. However, the Saxe-Coburg and Gotha name, stemming from the extensive ties between the British royal family and prominent German royal lines, became troublesome during the First World War. It served as a stark reminder that the royals possessed significant German ancestry. Indeed, George V was the first cousin of the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II. Particularly when the Germans began bombing London in 1917 using planes called Gotha bombers, it became clear that retaining the royal title was no longer sustainable. Consequently, in July 1917, the royal house's name was changed to the House of Windsor, adopted primarily due to the long-standing connection between the English crown and Windsor Castle west of London. The war eventually concluded in November 1918, rendering this name change of little practical consequence thereafter. But the new Windsor name would become intimately linked with Edward in time. The war's end brought forth the issue of Edward marrying and producing an heir to secure the line of succession. However, Edward's father, unlike most previous monarchs, was amenable to letting Edward decide his marital matters himself. By the late 1910s and 1920s, the British public was also more inclined to believe that mutual affection should factor into the prince's choice of a future queen. Edward himself was in no hurry, as the violence of the 1910s transitioned into the economic prosperity and social freedoms of the 1920s. Edward became a frequent visitor to London nightclubs and dance halls, where a group of followers attached themselves to the future king. He also commenced an affair with Winifred Dudley Ward, who was already married with 2 young children to William Dudley Ward, grandson of Lord Esher of the British nobility. Eventually, Ward divorced her husband, and the affair grew extremely serious in the 1920s, though Edward continued to see several other women sporadically during these years. Nevertheless, the relationship with Ward would not culminate in marriage, even after her divorce, and Edward ultimately ended it in 1934. This fondness for high living and Edward's complex love life had generated concerns within the government and among the royals themselves during the 1920s. Exacerbating this was what was seen as Edward's somewhat egalitarian manners and habits. During his military service, the prince had grown accustomed to seeking common ground with ordinary soldiers and persisted in these efforts during royal tours abroad to Canada and other regions in the 1920s. His easy rapport with common people would be viewed favorably in a royal family member today, but in the interwar period nearly a century ago, royals, senior politicians, and nobles regarded this with disapproval. Furthermore, many viewed Edward as a monarch who might attempt to wield excessive political independence. Thus, by the late 1920s, apprehension about the prince's conduct and views was mounting in senior political circles, concerns undoubtedly expressed privately when King George suffered a serious illness lasting several months in 1928 and 1929. He recovered and reigned for several more years, but worrying signs pointed towards a future clash between his successor and the political establishment. In the early 1930s, Edward encountered the woman who would shape the rest of his life. Wallis Simpson was an American socialite from Pennsylvania, born Bessie Wallace Warfield. 2 years younger than Edward, she grew up in Baltimore, supported along with her mother by affluent extended family. Their marriage was tumultuous, and although it lasted over 10 years, the couple spent long periods apart well before their eventual divorce in 1927. The following year, Wallis married Ernest Simpson, an American by birth who had cultivated extensive business links in Britain. Owing to his business activities, the Simpsons resided primarily in England by the early 1930s, where Wallis navigated high society circles. Much of their social standing was illusory, however, and Ernest Simpson's business affairs faced severe difficulties following the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression. This undoubtedly strained his and Wallis's marriage in the early 1930s, around the time she was first introduced to Prince Edward. 1934 proved a crucial year in the evolution of the relationship between the prince and Wallis Simpson. That year, he chose to terminate his intermittent affairs with Freda Dudley Ward and other mistresses like Lady Furness. Curiously, his fascination with Mrs. Simpson seems to have stemmed from her being the more assertive individual in the relationship. Edward retained a somewhat immature personality throughout his adulthood, and Simpson, as numerous reports from the mid-1930s suggested, appeared to have the prince completely under her control. For his part, Edward was clearly infatuated with her, and it seems apparent that by 1934 or 1935, he had resolved to marry her, intending for Simpson to become queen consort eventually. Early indications suggested this might not be feasible, however. When Edward introduced his American lover to his parents, they were unimpressed. Indeed, special branch police were even assigned to monitor the couple's activities from 1935 onwards. Two primary issues existed. First, Simpson was a divorcee, and on religious and moral grounds, it would be frowned upon for the future King of England to marry such a woman, let alone for her to become queen. Simpson's American origins and reports of her undue influence over Edward were also major concerns for worried observers in the mid-1930s. The question of the future queen consort became urgent before long. On the 20th of January 1936, at the age of 70, King George V passed away, and Edward was proclaimed King Edward VIII the next day. Initially, there were positive signals. George V had been unwell for many years, and his chronic respiratory issues had often hindered his ability to function as monarch. Furthermore, he was perceived by the public as an outdated figure, belonging more to the late 19th century than the emerging world of the interwar period. This public excitement for a new monarch following a long reign wasn't entirely uncommon in British political life, but in Edward's case, it would prove short-lived. The new king appears to have given almost no consideration to how he would govern upon succeeding his father. Nevertheless, it rapidly became evident that Edward was his father's opposite, showing very little interest in the actual matters of state. Ministers presented him with documents and state papers to which he paid little heed. Instead, he seemed content to continue his life much as before, including maintaining a busy social calendar in London. Within weeks, many in Westminster and elsewhere grew troubled by what they observed. Edward's lack of focus was particularly worrying because George Themerfield's death occurred at a moment of considerable global political difficulty. The aftermath of the First World War was immense. In Eastern Europe, the Russian Revolution had erupted in 1917, leading, after years of civil war, to the rise of the Soviet Union as a major world power ideologically opposed to nations like Britain. In the Far East, the Empire of Japan was rising as the dominant power, having begun aggressive expansion onto the Asian mainland several years earlier in 1931 by conquering the Chinese province of Manchuria. In Western Europe, Spain was on the verge of descending into a brutal civil war after years of instability, while elsewhere on the continent, fascist regimes and authoritarian governments had taken power in countries like Italy, Austria, and Hungary. Exacerbating the growth of extremist politics was the economic crisis initiated by the 1929 Wall Street crash, resulting in years of profound economic depression in the early 1930s. Amidst this landscape, Britain stood as a bastion of relative stability. Edward's duty as king would be to strive to maintain this stability in Britain's empire in India and Africa. However, among all the problems facing Europe, none was greater than that posed by Germany. The country had been left demoralized and destabilized by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, imposed by Britain and France in 1919. This treaty reassigned large portions of formerly German territory to its neighbors, levied huge financial reparations, and severely restricted its military size. Nonetheless, after several years of crisis in the late 1910s and early 1920s, the German Republic had achieved relative stability by the mid-1920s and was the continent's cultural hub. But the economic crisis of the late 1920s and early 1930s hit Germany particularly hard. Amidst this, an extremist party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler, managed to seize power early in 1933 after years of electoral progress. They swiftly transformed Germany into a one-party dictatorship, and in the year preceding Edward's accession, had begun aggressively rearming in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. One might have expected Edward's reign to be defined by opposition to Nazi aggression, but events quickly ensured the reign was short-lived, and Edward soon cultivated relationships with the Germans in ways that have shadowed his entire life since. Edward was known to feel an affinity for elements of the Nazi regime in Germany, an issue destined to create immense controversy, but the more immediate concern in the initial months of his reign was his relationship with Mrs. Simpson. Initially, the potential difficulty wasn't clear, but when foreign newspapers started reporting on the new king's holiday aboard a yacht on the Mediterranean with Simpson shortly after his accession, disquiet began to surface among government ministers in London. When it subsequently became apparent that Wallis Simpson was nearing the final stages of divorcing her second husband, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin's government had to adopt a stance. Baldwin was not inherently inclined towards intervening in such matters. Often perceived as a hesitant prime minister who excessively delayed major decisions, he also personally liked Edward and wasn't keen on confronting him about his potential marriage. He hesitated for as long as feasible, but eventually requested an audience with the king on the 20th of October 1936, possibly prompted by learning days earlier of Wallis's intention to finally divorce her long-suffering husband. During their meeting on October 20th, Baldwin advised the king that a press embargo on reports concerning the new monarch, legally mandated following a coronation, was about to lapse. Once expired, preventing newspapers and the public from extensive speculation about the king's relationship with Mrs. Simpson and his marriage intentions would become impossible. Consequently, he recommended that Wallis avoid finalizing her divorce immediately and leave Britain for some time until the issue could be more thoroughly discussed by all involved parties. The king dismissed Baldwin, asserting that Wallis's marital status was a private affair, despite the clear and profound implications her divorce would have for British public life if she subsequently married the king. Matters escalated from that point. A week later, on the 27th of October, Wallis secured her divorce, although prevailing laws meant she wouldn't be free to remarry for over 6 months. A week after that, Edward, still uncrowned as coronation plans were underway, opened a new parliament. Unbeknownst to him, the government had already contacted his brother, the Duke of York, preparing him for the possibility of succeeding his brother should the divorce issue necessitate abdication. Baldwin met the king again on the 16th of November. At this meeting, Edward conceded to a senior government member for the first time his intention to marry Wallis the following summer, once legally permissible. By then, Baldwin's government had started gathering opinions from within Britain and the Dominion states still under British rule. These revealed strong opposition, primarily on religious and moral grounds, to the idea of a monarch marrying a twice-divorced woman as his queen. Baldwin was also aware of particular hostility within Britain from organizations like the Church of England. However, Edward offered Baldwin a peculiar escape route, stating that if the government was determined to prevent his marriage to Wallis, he would step down rather than reject her. This, however, necessitated a parliamentary decree and would expose the monarchy to extensive parliamentary debate, a prospect welcomed by neither the government nor the royal family. The resolution to the escalating constitutional crisis arrived swiftly. Baldwin consulted the cabinet and Dominion secretaries in late November, and by early December, it was evident that no one supported Edward remaining king if he married Wallis. Furthermore, press silence was disintegrating, and discussion of the matter was becoming widespread. On December 3rd, Wallis temporarily departed for France to evade overt press speculation. Yet this did little to appease Baldwin's government, now insisting that Edward must abdicate if set on marrying Simpson. This is precisely what Edward did a week later, signing the official instrument on December 10th. Despite encouragement from figures like Winston Churchill to defend his rights as king, King Edward relinquished his position as monarch on the 11th of December 1936. At 327 days, it marked the shortest reign of any English monarch since the late 15th century. Edward's address to the nation, declaring his voluntary renunciation of the crown to marry the woman he loved, free from government coercion, represented something of a high point for him, perceived as composed and statesmanlike. The ensuing years would not witness a repeat of such conduct. The final matter concerned the titles the former king and his soon-to-be wife would hold. On December 13, 1936, the same day Edward formally announced his abdication, his brother and successor proposed that Edward and Wallis would henceforth bear the titles Duke and Duchess of Windsor, the royal family name adopted in 1917. Concurrently, the Duke and Duchess received extensive financial privileges, a lavish salary and estates. However, the royal family then initiated a process of distancing themselves from the former king and his new wife. As late as the 1940s, other family members and the king himself continued to refer to Wallis coldly as simply Mrs. Simpson. This occurred despite Edward and she having married at the Château de Condé near Tours, France, on June 3, 1937. The wedding was unattended by any royal family members and, apart from a congratulatory note from Baldwin's government, was largely ignored officially in Britain. Moreover, it was in France where they would primarily reside thereafter, generally living either in Paris or a country retreat. The rest of the royal family were pleased by this living abroad, and the general sentiment in Britain was a collective desire to forget Edward's brief 1936 kingship and the constitutional crisis it had provoked. Edward and Wallis settled in Paris, embarking on a relatively affluent lifestyle funded by the monies Edward received for relinquishing ownership of several royal residences in England as part of the abdication settlement. During this period, he telephoned his brother, the new king, every few days, often begging George VI that his wife be permitted the title Her Royal Highness in recognition of her status as the wife of a former British king. Nevertheless, this was denied, the apprehension in London being that Wallis might persist in using such a title at a later time, even if she divorced Edward. In the meantime, the newly married couple carried on enjoying Parisian life, though they seemed to hold the belief at this point that their stay was merely a temporary banishment. Messages soon arrived from England disabusing them of this idea, clarifying that it served everyone's interest best if they remained in Paris, far from Britain. As the full impact of the rejection he was experiencing settled upon Edward, he started devising methods to establish a new role for himself in European public affairs. While many might have preferred to withdraw from the public gaze as swiftly as possible and seek a quieter existence for a period, considering the difficult experience of Edward's short reign, he and Wallis promptly embarked on the most contentious chapter of the former king's life. As previously noted, the early 1930s had seen the ascent of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis to power in Germany. Now, shortly following his abdication, Edward consented to an offer to visit Germany. This action requires context. Numerous individuals traveled to Germany in the mid-1930s, wishing to observe firsthand what was unfolding there. For example, the former British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, head of state in Britain from 1916 to 1922, had visited the country in late 1936 while the constitutional crisis regarding Edward was unfolding back home. When evaluating any of these visits, it is crucial to recall that many British people in the mid-1930s regarded Hitler as a vital defense against the rise of a communist state in Germany. And secondly, individuals like Lloyd George were unaware, when they chose to visit Germany, of the atrocities the Nazis would inflict across Europe just a few years later. The invitation to visit Germany was extended to Edward in the late summer of 1937 by Dr. Robert Ley, leader of the German Labor Front, an entity established by the Nazis in Germany to supplant trade unions and suppress any socialist unrest. The offer originated from this organization because figures like Edward and Lloyd George the preceding year were primarily invited to witness how Germany had surmounted its economic difficulties and was managing its factories through bodies like the Labor Front. Edward accepted, apparently driven by a desire to restore his public image following his kingship. A tour of the United States was also arranged, and he seems to have conceived the notion that he could serve as an individual promoting new ideas to prevent political conflicts across the Western world, similar to those that had overwhelmed Spain and plunged it into civil war. In essence, Edward sought to visit Germany to understand how the further advancement of communism and radical socialism could be checked. Thus, by the early autumn of 1937, he had accepted the invitation, and information about the forthcoming visit was conveyed to the British ambassador in Berlin, George Ogilvy Forbes. The tour began on the morning of October 11th when the Windsors arrived at Friedrichstrasse station in Berlin. Despite being presented as a private tour rather than a royal visit, the couple was greeted at the station not only by Robert Ley but also by Joachim von Ribbentrop, who would soon be named German foreign minister and still held the position of German ambassador to the United Kingdom. The trip subsequently spanned 12 days, concluding on October 23rd. Much of it involved, similar to Lloyd George's visit the year before, tours of German factories and various government facilities. These ranged from the ordinary, like visiting a light bulb factory, to the unsettling, notably a trip to a newly constructed concentration camp, whose true nature the Windsors were admittedly misled about. Other stops included visits to Hitler youth academies and factories owned by major German corporations like Krupp's. The consistent theme was to project an image of efficient German industry, featuring well-managed factories, a nation back at work after the economic struggles of the early 1930s, and contented, enthusiastic workers. Significant efforts were also made to underscore Britain's cultural ties to Germany, with the national anthems of both nations played whenever Edward and Wallis arrived at a factory or academy. The overarching aim was to persuade the couple that Germany represented a model for halting the spread of radical socialism on the continent, and that the Nazis were Britain's natural allies. Throughout their visit, the Windsors encountered several high-ranking members of the Nazi regime. For instance, on their first evening in Berlin, von Ribbentrop escorted the couple to dinner at Horker's, a favored gathering place for the Nazi leadership in the capital. Accompanied by the German architect Albert Speer, later Minister of Armaments, and the Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels, along with his wife Magda. More controversially, Edward and Wallis met Hermann Göring, chief of the newly established German Air Force, and Hitler's second-in-command, at his hunting estate outside Berlin on October 14th. This included a meeting in Göring's study where the Nazi minister displayed a map of Central Europe showing Austria as part of a Nazi-controlled Greater Germany. Despite the clear indication that Germany planned to annex an independent neighbor soon, Edward voiced no objections. When this was coupled with reports of the Duke and Duchess visiting armaments factories where German tanks, armored vehicles, and submarines were evidently being manufactured, and Edward offering the Nazi salute to numerous officials during the trip, it is easy to understand how concerns arose and have persisted ever since. If the impression left on contemporaries and posterity by the Windsors' nearly 2-week stay in Germany wasn't detrimental enough, it climaxed with a personal meeting between Hitler and Edward on October 22nd. This took place at the Berghof, the Nazi leader's alpine residence on the southern border between Germany and Austria. Accounts of the meeting and the subsequent conversation after Wallis joined them vary. For instance, some describe it as a rather inconsequential encounter involving social pleasantries, vague expressions of friendship between the German and British nations, exchanged compliments, and followed by tea. Others, however, assert that Edward signaled his active backing for Germany's increasingly aggressive foreign policy and Hitler's ambitions to acquire territory in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. There is certainly no evidence suggesting the former king tried to deter German expansionism. Finally, upon concluding the meeting, the former king and the German chancellor parted ways by exchanging the Nazi salute. Unsurprisingly, the question of what might have been discussed in Germany during the Windsors' visit, particularly during Edward's meetings with Hitler, Göring, and others, has sparked considerable controversy. Some speculate that discussions touched upon Edward facilitating an alliance between Germany and Britain as Germany expanded on the continent and countered a further rise of communism. These theories gained traction from the fact that the minutes of the meeting between Hitler and Edward on October 22nd were later destroyed. What necessitated their destruction? Other evidence remains open to interpretation. For instance, on the final evening of their tour, the Windsors were hosted in Munich by Rudolf Hess, Hitler's longtime private secretary, and his wife Ilse. At one point, Rudolf and Edward vanished for about an hour, leaving behind their interpreters and all other staff. An hour later, they were discovered upstairs. Rudolf was purportedly showing Edward his model ship collection, but was that the true activity, or was something more ominous under discussion? While historians extensively debate the trip, what is universally acknowledged by Edward's biographers and historians of the mid-20th century royals is that it revealed an astounding lack of judgment by the former king, permanently casting a shadow of disgrace over his life, and the repercussions didn't cease when the Windsors left Germany on October 23, 1937. As shall be seen, fresh rumors and anxieties surfaced during the Second World War, which Edward and Wallis did little to alleviate. Following their German tour, Edward and Wallis returned to Paris, renting a mansion on the Boulevard Suchet, where they resided in the late 1930s. As they settled in, the Germans escalated their aggression globally. Already during their 1937 visit, Hitler had been exerting increasing pressure on Austria to compel a political union with Berlin. The Anschluss, creating a Greater Germany, was finally realized in March 1938, violating the Versailles Treaty. Within weeks, Hitler advanced the case for annexing the Sudetenland, a region of western Czechoslovakia predominantly populated by ethnic Germans. At the Munich Conference in September 1938, Britain and France yielded to Hitler's demands but stipulated that any further Nazi expansion attempts at the expense of Germany's neighbors would lead to war. For the former king and his wife in France, they, like everyone else, must have anticipated an imminent German invasion. Yet as autumn transitioned to winter, and 1940 arrived with Poland long subjugated by the Germans and no westward offensive launched, many started referring to a phony war. Spring dispelled such hopes across Europe. In April 1940, the Nazis invaded Denmark and strategically occupied key cities and towns in Norway. Just weeks later, an invasion of the Low Countries in France commenced. This action reignited concerns about Edward, accused by some British diplomats of leaking information to Berlin that aided the German attack on Belgium. The accusation became particularly severe when the British expeditionary force to France found itself cornered at Dunkirk in late May due to the unexpected success of the German dual assault on Belgium and northeast France. Only a courageous amphibious rescue operation saved hundreds of thousands of British troops from annihilation or capture. The French, however, faced a different fate, and on June 14, 1940, Paris fell to the Nazis. The city and France overall would stay under German dominion for the next 4 years. Despite their prior amicable relations with the Nazis, the Duke and Duchess became targets of a plot by Hitler and the Nazi paramilitary organization, the SS, in the summer of 1940. The aim of the plan, codenamed Operation Willy, was to abduct the Windsors, who had departed Paris during the invasion of France in May 1940, traveling south to Biarritz and then crossing into Spain, intending ultimately to reach Portugal. Operation Willy was formulated while they journeyed through Spain, which under General Francisco Franco's fascist dictatorship maintained friendly ties with Hitler's government. At this point, a revised plan emerged. Edward would be lured back into Spain and apprehended there. However, even Walter Schellenberg, the SS official overseeing the operation, who later became head of Nazi foreign intelligence, subsequently admitted the scheme was preposterous. Operation Willy never materialized, but the Windsors' arrival in Lisbon and the perpetual lack of discretion shown by Edward and Wallis upon their arrival exposed them to further allegations of treasonous behavior. Accusations which, like their 1937 Germany visit, have generated enduring suspicions never fully dispelled. The Windsors had apparently chosen to travel to Spain and Portugal in May 1940 due to concerns about their reduced status in Britain and certain tax liabilities they would face upon returning home. Back in Britain, this failure to return looked extremely unfavorable, and the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, viewed it with particular disapproval. Matters grew even more suspicious when the Windsors arrived in Portugal and readily accepted an offer to stay at the home of Ricardo Espírito Santo, a Portuguese banker with extensive German business ties, suspected of having sufficient connections with Hitler and the Nazis for MI6, the British intelligence service, to have initiated a file on him. Perhaps Edward and Wallis were ignorant of this, but it seems improbable. By accepting Santo's hospitality, the former king was either engaging in discussions with Santo or behaving with incredible irresponsibility, almost guaranteeing his loyalty would be questioned. Yet worse was to come. Recent research indicates that while in Portugal, Edward advocated, through Ricardo Espírito Santo, for the Nazis to, quote, bomb Britain into peace. Edward here was seemingly suggesting the Nazis adopt an aerial bombing strategy over England, particularly London, to compel the British government's surrender without requiring a land invasion. It's possible Edward saw this as the lesser of two evils compared to a land invasion, but there's absolutely no denying that, coming from a member of the royal family, this advice amounted to treason of the highest order. In the following months, tens of thousands of bombs rained down on Britain, causing approximately 40,000 civilian deaths. In September and October 1940 alone, London endured bombing almost nightly. Edward apparently advocated for Berlin to pursue this strategy to force surrender and potentially reinstate him as King of Britain following capitulation. Edward's potential treachery while in Lisbon did not cease with his brief stay in Portugal. As soon as he and Wallis arrived, Churchill initiated steps to remove Edward from continental Europe, while simultaneously preventing his return to Britain. He could not allow the Duke to reside on the continent, potentially falling into Nazi hands. The risk of collusion with the Nazis and a potential deal for reinstatement as King of England had become too significant. Concurrently, Edward's actions, fleeing to Portugal and visiting Germany in 1937, made him a liability if brought back to England. Consequently, Churchill dispatched a statement to Lisbon announcing Edward's appointment as the new governor of the Bahamas, the British island colony north of Cuba. Edward eventually accepted the role, and he and Wallis departed Portugal aboard the steamship Excalibur on August 1, 1940. However, 2 weeks after leaving Portugal, Edward engaged in possibly his most incriminating act yet. On August 15th, he sent a telegram to Espírito Santo, his and Wallis's Portuguese host, requesting word as soon as action was needed. When this document became public in 1957, Edward downplayed its significance, but it appears to provide evidence that Edward sought updates from a known German agent regarding any developments that might lead to his return to Europe to be installed as a puppet king of England should Germany defeat Britain. Suspicions surrounding Edward and his wife's actions over the preceding years remained substantial enough that when the couple chose to visit the United States from the Bahamas in the spring of 1941, they were surveilled by the Federal Bureau of Investigation under instructions from President Franklin D. Roosevelt. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI acted on intelligence from a German monk residing in the U.S. who claimed Wallis Simpson had been the lover of Joachim von Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, back in 1936 during his tenure as Nazi ambassador to Britain. Suspicions were also fueled by a different English informant alleging Edward had arranged with Hermann Göring that, should the war end in German victory, Göring would then attempt to overthrow Hitler and subsequently install Edward as King of England. Ascertaining how much of this was based on credible information versus the wild speculations of FBI informants is extremely difficult, but it underscores the level of concern surrounding Edward and Wallis during the war years that they were shadowed by FBI agents during this initial visit to Florida from the Bahamas in 1941 and again on several subsequent occasions after the U.S. entered the war in December 1941. We may never fully separate fact from fiction regarding Edward's interactions with the Nazis, but one thing is certain. Any plot he might have been involved in failed to materialize. Instead, Edward and Wallis spent the period from autumn 1940 until the war's end in 1945, largely based in the Bahamas, a region Edward scornfully described as a third-rate colony. He held contempt for the native population, viewing them as racially inferior to their colonial administrators, potentially making him the least suitable person imaginable to handle serious riots over low wages that erupted across the islands in the summer of 1942. However, Edward managed these situations diplomatically and, as governor, implemented policies of poor relief and public works to aid island development and mitigate resentment against Crown authority. Nevertheless, he and Wallis were anxious to depart what they viewed as a colonial outpost of exile, and in mid-March 1945, months before the war concluded, the former king resigned his governorship of the island archipelago. That winter, the German Third Reich reached its peak extent as German forces neared Moscow and Leningrad. However, they failed to capture the cities, and by 1942, Russian resistance had stalled the war on the Eastern Front. Subsequently, Germany's position gradually deteriorated as resources dwindled. The U.S. entry into the war late in 1941 started to make an impact, and the Soviet Union's vastly superior manpower became the decisive element on the Eastern Front. By the summer of 1943, the Russians were driving the Germans back towards Poland and Ukraine, and the Western Allies successfully established a new front in southern Italy. By the time the Western Front was opened in France by the Western Allies in the summer of 1944, it was essentially a race to Berlin between the Soviets from the east and the British and Americans from the west. Ultimately, the Russians reached Berlin first, with the Western Allies occupying western and southern Germany. The war concluded in early May 1945, days after Hitler took his own life in Berlin. In the immediate post-war period, despite the numerous unresolved questions surrounding Edward's conduct, both before and during the war, he faced no overt criticism in the British press. Nevertheless, a clear preference existed for both him and Wallis to revert to the arrangement established in the late 1930s. They would return to France and reside there, rather than in Britain, where their presence could prove problematic. However, even after they resettled in Paris while Europe underwent reconstruction, another issue emerged, enabling Edward to resume his plotting. His brother, King George VI, suffered from poor health at a relatively young age due to chronic smoking. The prospect of him stepping down or dying was already significant by the mid-1940s. From a distance, Edward engaged in correspondence with individuals in England, suggesting he could return to Britain and potentially act as regent for his young niece, Princess Elizabeth, whom he alleged would otherwise fall under the sway of her Mountbatten in-laws. The plan amounted to nothing, and George would, in any case, live until 1952, by which time Elizabeth was well into her mid-20s. Yet it highlights Edward's relentless ambition and scheming that even after the disgrace following the war, he continued exploring ways to re-enter British public life. Notably, he did not attend Elizabeth's coronation, instead watching it on television from Paris. This, however, marked the end of his efforts in this area. When Elizabeth succeeded and commenced her long and prosperous reign in 1952, her uncle and his wife resigned themselves to life in Paris. There they evolved into a somewhat peculiar celebrity couple, the former King of Britain and his American wife, who had significantly disrupted British politics before the war. They associated with British expatriates in the city and participated in France's post-war café society. Meanwhile, Edward augmented their substantial income in the financial benefits lingering from the late 1930s agreement with the British government by engaging in illicit currency trading. He also authored A King's Story, a memoir published in 1951, articulating his opposition to the type of liberal politics prevalent in the post-war Western world. It was also the first book published by a former. Furthermore, as the early 1950s transitioned into the mid to late 1950s, they increased their visits to the United States, mingling with politicians and celebrities, and even visiting the White House during Dwight Eisenhower's presidency. Thus, they became a celebrity couple of a sort, albeit an unusual one, seemingly posing no further threat to the stability of public life back in Britain. Wallis and Edward's relationship remained enigmatic to many commentators in the post-war era. Several individuals who spent time with them during the 1950s observed their apparent distance from each other, seldom addressing remarks directly. It presented a strange dynamic for a couple whose bond had supposedly been so intense 20 years prior that Edward was willing. For a period in the mid-1960s, they returned to Britain and spent considerable time there, attending various royal events from 1965 onwards, notably the funeral of Princess Marina of Kent. Marina was Edward's sister-in-law via her marriage to his brother, also confusingly named George, the same as his king brother, who adopted George as his regnal name, but was christened Albert. Edward, like Marina, was not far from his own end. Now in his early 70s, he faced escalating health issues, mostly linked to his chronic smoking. Between attending events in Britain in the mid-1960s, he frequently traveled to America for medical consultations and underwent several surgical procedures, particularly to address his coronary problems. Ultimately, the prince's lifelong indulgence in smoking exacted its price. In the early 1970s, throat cancer was identified. It proved untreatable and terminal. By this stage, he and Wallis had established themselves once more in Paris. Yet although the former king had little time remaining, he was fortunate enough to receive a visit from his niece, Queen Elizabeth II, who happened to be conducting a state visit to France around that period. Edward passed away on the 28th of May, 1972 in Paris. His body was swiftly transported to England, where it lay in a state at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, rather than the traditional Westminster Hall. Somewhat remarkably, a significant portion of the British populace filed past in the ensuing days to offer their final tributes to the king, who had briefly reigned 3.5 decades prior. The funeral service took place on the 5th of June, attended by Queen Elizabeth, the royal family, and Wallis Simpson. Subsequently, he was interred at the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore. This was perhaps unexpected, as considerable conjecture had existed over the years regarding where in Britain, if anywhere, Edward would be laid to rest. In death, much like in life, the former king remained a figure of political fascination. Edward's widow did not experience a favorable life following his demise. Wallis resided continuously in France, financially sustained by her late husband's estate and an allowance from Queen Elizabeth. However, her health deteriorated, and by the late 1970s, she was exhibiting advanced dementia. She also grew increasingly frail and susceptible to falls, breaking her hip on 2 separate occasions, while from 1980 onwards, she lost her capacity for speech. Consequently, her final years were predominantly spent confined to her home, with her mental abilities declining sharply. Compounding her situation, she fell prey to exploitation by her French lawyer, Suzanne Blum, who obtained power of attorney for the progressively incapacitated Wallis. Blum leveraged her authority to exploit Simpson financially. Eventually, Wallis died in Paris on the 24th of April 1986 at the age of 89. Her funeral occurred a few days later at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Her marriage to Edward, which had encountered numerous obstacles and sparked many controversies, had endured despite these challenges, and she was buried beside him near Windsor Castle. King Edward VIII stands as one of the most contentious figures in modern British public life. In 1936, he ascended to the British throne and became Emperor of India while still a bachelor in his early 40s. Nevertheless, though unmarried and lacking an heir, he was an individual with a varied romantic history, and therein lay the issue. The new king was not only recognized for his extensive social activities as Prince of Wales during the 1920s and 1930s, but was also a subject of widespread gossip due to his numerous affairs with married women. One such relationship proved problematic from the outset of his brief reign. By 1934, Edward had become utterly captivated by Wallis Simpson, an American who had divorced once already and would need to do so again to marry Edward. When it became evident that this was precisely their intention, it ignited a national controversy. It has been extensively debated ever since whether the matter of Simpson being a multiple divorcee was the genuine reason for Edward's forced abdication at the close of 1936, or if he was merely disliked within political and social circles, with Simpson used as a pretext to remove him in favor of the far more conventional George VI. Regardless of the true motive, the outcome remained unchanged. Edward abdicated, rendering him the shortest reigning monarch in nearly 5 centuries. Had events concluded there, we might view Edward today as a more sympathetic figure, someone whose crown was unjustly taken due to the antiquated religious and marital moral standards prevalent in the 1930s. There is no question that Edward supported fascism as a defense against socialism in Europe. The nature of any conspiracies potentially hatched in 1937 remains ambiguous, but we are certain that in 1940, following the swift Nazi conquest of France, Edward and Wallis's adopted home, the couple interacted with Nazi agents across Western Europe in the subsequent months. Was Edward scheming to return as King of Britain within a Nazi-controlled Europe? Certainty eludes us, but what is perfectly apparent is that by behaving as he did and exposing himself to the accusations he faced, Edward forever stained himself as the potential traitor king.